Hey everyone. If you love this podcast, can you do me a big favor and please give us a review on whatever platform you're using and tell a friend or family member to subscribe? And speaking of subscribing, that's the best way to keep up because you'll get a notification each time we upload a new episode. So make sure you hit subscribe on whatever platform you're now using. Finally, if you're feeling generous, appreciative, or perhaps a bit guilty for getting all this free content, go to patreon.com/The Suzanne Venker Show and become a member. You'll get free ebooks, early access to the episodes, and a chance to win the occasional free 30-minute coaching session with yours truly. From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week as we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narratives about men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. Hey everyone. So today we're going to dive into a very uncomfortable conversation. It's about the idea that daycare is harmless or even good for children. And by children, I'm referring specifically to babies and toddlers. But before we get to that, I wanted to share with you a few comments from last week's episode, 157, about the Pew study, which showed that 88% of parents prioritize money and career over marriage for their adult children. I made a case for why this is a big mistake and identified 6 reasons why women in particular should do the exact opposite and prioritize marriage instead. One woman, I didn't get the names of these particular women for some reason, but at any rate, one writes, "Yep, right on, 100%. Never wanted kids and had no desire to get married. It feels like the day I turned 30, everything changed. This is so important to teach young women." Then this woman writes, "We've also done a bad job of explaining to girls and young women that when you have a baby, your view of the world profoundly transforms, and you won't see career the same way anymore. The biological light bulb that goes off is blinding, and no one tells girls that it takes everything but the immediate family and puts it at the end of the line." I love the way she puts this. "They have no clue how great an impact the change in hormones will create in them. We tell women that they are all brain and will and attitude and never explain to them that the motherhood hormone cocktail will rewrite all of that in a nanosecond." I got more comments than that, but those were the few that stood out. Okay, and finally, one other thing. A few people thought that I had said in that episode that no one should get married before the age of 25, so I'd like to correct that misconception, or at least explain it better if I didn't the first time. I was talking about the data, basically, showing that your risk of divorce goes up slightly if you marry prior to 25. So 25 is sort of a benchmark, but the stats combine. They do it where they say 18 to 25. They mix those folks in one group, and then over 25, it drops precipitously. So obviously, there's a big difference between, say, an 18-year-old getting married and a 24-year-old. So you have to kind of, use common sense. It's just a general idea. So somewhere around the age of 25 is just simply ideal. That's all. That was my point. It's not that if you get married at 23 or 24, you're in trouble. So I just wanted to clarify that. And now, on with the show. I'd like to begin by pointing out that while this topic, the topic of daycare, is very much a political issue, unfortunately, that's what it has become over the last really 40 years, our political parties could not care less about this issue. And I want to be really clear about this. I genuinely mean that. Neither side wants to deal with the truth about how harmful daycare is because it messes with their goal of getting more women in the workforce, which is absolutely a bipartisan matter. So looking to our government to help solve this problem is pointless. I'm sure you see articles all the time arguing for more and better daycare, and that will solve women's problems and whatnot. Totally pointless. The one and only way to fix this, to the degree that we ever will, is to change parents' hearts and minds by educating them about this very sensitive issue. Unfortunately, We also happen to live at a time when we don't want to face hard things. We don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or, God forbid, guilty, when in fact it's in the discomfort and it's in the guilt where the answers lie. Walking around the elephant in the room doesn't make the elephant go away. So that's why I wanted to do this episode. I actually covered this material, believe it or not, in the first book I ever wrote some 20 years ago now. So it's been kind of nice for me to revisit this material. I'm going to begin with some general statements about daycare and then move on to the most common myths and explain why we have it all wrong in this country when it comes to this issue. One of the things I've noticed is a real difference between today's generation of women and, let's say, yesterday's generation of women. So I'm going to use a 20-year span for that. When I wrote my first book on the subject, again, like I said, it was just about 20 years ago, the mommy wars were all the rage. I mean, you could not get through a day without reading an article, and that is no exaggeration, arguing for why daycare is great. And then you'd read the occasional, article if you dug deeply enough about why that's not true, because you know who's going to get the most coverage on that. Obviously, it's a certain group of people who think daycare is a great thing. So when I was writing my book, there was just no shortage of research at all. I was just up to my eyeballs in it. And so it was very clear then that there was just sort of one side who believed mothers should work and the other who believed they should stay home. Again, this is 20 years ago. Now, I've noticed quite a shift over these past few decades where young mothers now, I truly believe this, genuinely view daycare as harmless. And you can tell this by the way they talk about it. So in the past, it was common to hear mothers explain why they were putting their kids in daycare. It was almost always a financial argument. Whereas today, you might as well be talking about the weather. There's just no need to explain it or to justify it, I guess is a better word. That's just gone. And so, whereas before, you guys didn't know me 20 years ago when I first got into this, and I was doing a lot of radio at the time, I would engage in debates about this subject. But now I believe it's absolutely more about education. I'm convinced that young mothers today have no clue whatsoever about what babies and toddlers, well, children, but babies and toddlers in particular, need. And of course, why would they? They're coming sort of after this decades-long process of normalizing alternative care for our children. And then, of course, the economy changing so dramatically that it is no longer considered anything to raise an eyebrow about. So they really, who would have told them? So why would they know, Unless you're child focused by nature and you go to school to learn this information, you really would have no way of knowing what I'm about to share with you. So let's begin with this. Daycare in its original form was designed as a rare and last-ditch solution for struggling families. It was never meant to be the norm. The only reason it became normalized, which was in the 70s, is because feminists wanted women in the workforce. That was their goal, as you all well know. And the only way to accomplish this in any kind of big way was to tout daycare as harmless. And the irony of feminists convincing everyday women that daycare is harmless is kind of laughable, since feminists are the last people on earth who would know and understand the needs of children. Most of the outspoken feminists among us don't even have kids. In fact, that's what initially got me started with my work all these years ago. The idea that everyday women were making these major life decisions based on the lies they were being fed by a group of women who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. That was so frustrating to me as someone who knew the other side and knew how wrong that was. And so that's how I got started in my, I guess you'd call it, activism at the time. The second general observation I want to make is that when it comes to this issue, self-awareness is key. In order to make any headway, You really have to be able to reject the status quo and be open to the truth about daycare and the needs of children, which may mean making some serious changes. But I know that millions of women would make those different choices if they understood some things that have been kept from them. Those who become defensive, alternatively, upon hearing these facts aren't really ready or able to make the necessary changes that they could if they were more open. I've personally heard from countless women over the years who were very open and able to make changes, and it just changed their lives. And it's like I want to scream out to everybody what I'm reading on my end. And in fact, next week's episode is going to be with one of those women, so make sure you don't miss that. Okay, here are 5 big myths about daycare. Ready? Number 1. I think the most common phrase you probably hear, I know I do, is this idea that there is no right or wrong. It's just whatever's right for you and your family. When you hear people, whether or not their kids are in daycare, it's no longer, or babies or toddlers are in daycare, it's no longer about, like I said before, explaining it, but just whatever's right for you, whatever's good. This is how you know that the idea of daycare has been fully accepted as normal, despite the fact that there's actually nothing normal about it, which is what we're going to get into. When you hear people talk about it, it's always couched in terms of what the woman wants, as if it's just a benign choice between two things. Yeah, do you want to stay home? Do you not want to stay home? There's absolutely no conversation about what children need. None. Zero. It's not there. It's all about choice. So what started out as an abortion conversation when it came to choice is now fully into the daycare conversation as well. But the truth, of course, that women are not told is that babies need their mothers, or at the very least, one substitute or additional caregiver in order to have their needs met. And obviously, this is never going to happen in daycare. That's why it's so bad, because it's not going to be able to meet the needs of your children. So the reason why it is stated as a benign choice, that there's no right or wrong, it's just whatever works for your family, is meant solely to alleviate guilt. Again, going back to this, what I said earlier about we're no longer allowed to feel uncomfortable. We shy away from anything that's uncomfortable or makes us feel like we have to look at ourselves, even though that's where the answer lies. You're never going to get to the answer if you cannot be self-reflective and face your feelings about this issue. It's just meant to alleviate guilt, but guilt can be a great tool. So, for example, the average mother who drops her baby off at daycare, or 6-week-old baby off at daycare, or 12-week or whatever, most of them are extremely agitated and depressed and have a horrendous time doing that. They are crying. It's awful. It's just, they're going against what is the most natural thing in the world, and that's to be with your baby, not to separate from him at that stage of life. And so when they're having those feelings, they turn to social media or even their family and friends, and they're quickly told not to worry about it, to get over it, that their babies will be fine, that they'll be fine, this is normal, which essentially amounts to their being socialized to separate from their babies long before their own bodies are telling them that they should. So in reality, what they should be doing is listening to that feeling that they have. It's nobody putting it there. It's their body reacting. It's their body reacting and saying, this isn't the way you need to be doing this. This isn't good. This isn't right. You're not ready. Baby's not ready. Don't do it. I mean, that's essentially what your body's saying. But then you have society socializing you and forcing you to disconnect from your baby long before you should. It's not time yet. So that's a great example of how we steer and socialize women away from what is the most natural thing in the world, and that's their bodies talking to them. And instead of listening to it, we push it away. Number 2, this is a bigger one. I don't know, it's a bigger one. It's just as big. You probably hear a lot of people talk about how, oh, the baby, those early years, all you really need are to take care of their physical needs. They just need, someone to keep them warm and dry and fed. And really anybody can do that at that stage. It's when they're older that it gets harder. This could not be more wrong. Could not be more wrong. The physical needs of your baby in the first 3 years are the bare minimum. They barely scratch the surface of what's going on in those years. So this is where I'm going to talk to you about attachment theory specifically, that is taught nowhere in any open way, like I said, unless you happen to go study early childhood education and learn about it. But in the regular world, you're never going to hear this information. Nevertheless, it is well known among the experts. All this information is well known among the experts that the relationships a baby forms in the first years of life have a deep impact on their long-term well-being. Again, this may be news to the average parent, but it's not news to child psychologists, many of whom have had a terrible time getting this message out because of the political implications. I remember that was another big part of when I wrote my first book, is unearthing all this information from the experts who were very open about the fact, well, I can't go on media, I can't go out on TV or in any media and say this because they're going to twist it or reject me or whatever. It's just there's a concerted effort to keep this information from the public. So you really have to dig to get it. But attachment is the process that occurs within the first 3 years of life. It's when you know that your mother or your one primary attachment figure is going to be there physically and emotionally to calm your distress when you are distressed and to react to you when you communicate. Let's put it that way. It's a different type of communication, obviously, in those early years. And this relationship is very, very delicate and it's very time intensive. And it's a slow, gradual process of what appears to be very trivial communication cues between mom/caregiver and baby and the responses to them that aren't trivial at all. In other words, you're not just changing their diapers and feeding them. Something is actually occurring that you can't put your finger on, but it's happening. You can't see it unless you really are paying attention and you're doing the work. Then you'll see it. And it's in this experience in the early years of our lives where we as humans develop our attachment or ability to bond. And there's technically 4 types of attachment. The fourth is the one that you ideally want, and that's secure attachment. But there's ambivalent attachment, avoidant, and disorganized. And then there's secure, and secure is the goal. Children who know they can depend on their caregivers will show distress when they're separated from them and joy when they're reunited. That's a secure attachment. It's not that you can't detach, but you show normal distress because you love and are attached to your person. And so when you're separated, you're going to be a little distressed, and then you're going to be really happy when you're reunited. So the other 3 types of attachment are different: the ambivalent, avoidant, and disorganized. Ambivalent is children who become very distressed when a parent leaves, like they cannot detach. And this is a general result of poor parental availability. These children know they can't depend on their primary caregiver to be there when they need them. And so they get very distressed when you leave. Then avoidant attachment is children who tend to show no preference between a caregiver or a stranger. It's like, okay, whoever's going to take care of me is fine. And this is more extreme. This is really when you have more of like very neglectful parents or even abusive ones. You just you're kind of going with the flow. You'll go with whoever's there just to get through the day or whatever. And then there's disorganized. And these children they display more of a confusing mix of behavior where it's like they may avoid or resist the parent, but it's a little different from the other 2. So the bottom line is you don't have to have all this in your brain to know that just the goal is secure attachment. And these are the children who feel reassured that the caregiver is going to return. So they're securely attached because they have this continuity with their person, that she or he, but usually she, is going to respond to his needs. And so if you're left to cry, for example, endlessly, when you're 1, 2, 3 years, I'm not talking about newborns with the sleep thing, but like later on, and nobody comes to you, that's what I'm talking about. So the goal is to have a secure attachment. And once that's taken place, then the toddler will begin to branch out because they feel secure enough to do so. They can be around others comfortably because they know when mom drops them off, she's coming back. It's really all about consistency and forming that bond early on. This is obviously not something that's ever going to happen in daycare for the obvious reason. It's a completely different environment where you're throwing a baby who's too young to be there into this very stressful, loud place where there's no one person assigned to you, just you and that person. Which is why everyone knows there's sort of an order of the best people to care for a baby, a newborn, or the first 3 years, let's say. Everyone kind of knows it, but they don't, ever want to talk about it openly, but I'll talk about it. Mom is obviously best. If mom can't be there, there's dad is option 2, then a grandma or other trusted family member, then a nanny, and then even before you go to daycare, potentially sharing one nanny, 2 or 3 children. Like if you're gonna, like with your neighborhood moms, and they're gonna work, and you're gonna put your kids together with one person, kind of thing. And then the last ditch effort, like I said, would be daycare, and that's, like I said, how it was originally intended. And my point is that option that's at the bottom is now at the top, right next to mom, right next to her. Like, you're going to stay home or you're not going to stay home. Whatever works for you. It's all good. It's all good. As though there isn't a massive difference between those two choices, which of course there is. So that idea that I guess that kind of combines the first two myths, that, whatever's right for you and your family, and that babies really don't need much of anything except physical care in the early years. I'd say those were the two biggest myths that are sort of accepted as fact, if only because nobody wants to challenge it. Nobody has the courage to challenge it, even if they know it, which I'm not, some people know it, some people don't, but the ones who do wouldn't even say anything if they did. Number 3, this is one of my favorites. When mom is happy, the kids are happy. So whatever she needs to do for herself is all that really matters in the end. Oh my gosh, that is utter and complete bunk. At least in the way it's presented. I mean, obviously no one wants an unhappy parent. But if mom's version of being happy is to be away from her child the majority of his waking hours, that's not going to translate to the child being happy for you. Unless the mother is causing her children physical or mental harm, her children honestly don't really care whether or not she's happy. All they care about is whether or not their needs are getting met. And when they are not, they can't verbalize it, so they act out. This is one of the reasons why we see so many behavior problems in very young children. For exactly this reason, they can't say what they're thinking and feeling. They can't even really make sense of it themselves. That's what we parents are supposed to do. And so the behavior is an indication of what's going on. In fact, children's poor behavior, if you want to call it poor behavior, or, when they're acting out in the first 3 or 4 years, it's very much like the guilt feeling I was talking about earlier to listen to. It's like a sign. If you see it, it's not something to, that's a signal that something is going wrong, and it's your job to figure out how to make it go right. It's not something to punish. It's something to understand. So I remember like a really big issue when I was home with my kids, and I was in some mommy groups, and obviously I was with a lot of other moms who were home with their kids. The number of times I saw children who were unbelievably sleep deprived, totally and completely sleep deprived, because their parents, their moms, had not put them on a schedule of any kind. I don't even mean, again, this can happen whether you're home or not. So this isn't a daycare issue per se. I mean, it is a daycare issue because you can't get this consistency in the sleep schedule you need if you're in daycare. That's a given. But this is also something that even at-home moms will struggle with, because essentially you have to be so vigilant and so consistent on that sleep, and it means you're not going to be able to live life the way you want for that period of time. You're going to miss out on doing all kinds of things in order to give that consistency to the baby. And a lot of people aren't willing to do that. And my point in bringing this up is to say that what I would see is children who are acting out because they literally can't help it. It's not that they are acting out or behaving poorly. It's that their bodies are reacting to not getting the sleep they need. They're sleep deprived, and their bodies will react before they can even they're not even thinking about how they're behaving. It's just happening almost. And if you don't see this as a parent, you will and might and do punish them as if they're doing something wrong. It's your job to be there to make sure they have the greatest leg up on their health, and that includes sleeping right, so that you can then address actual behavior problems when they arise. So you're not confused about whether or not this is a matter of being sleep deprived or not. And that gives you a signal as to whether or not you can, how to handle the situation. Okay, number 4. This is what you'll hear most in the media, because this is a political issue. Daycare gives children a leg up academically. This whole phrase, early childhood education, is a euphemism for daycare because it sounds better, and those in power know that, and they want to get your kids as quickly as they can into group care, i.e. school. They'll call it school, even though it's babysitting and daycare when you're 2 and 3 years old, and sell you on the idea that your child will be given a leg up academically. This is patently false in every conceivable way. It is purely a political ploy to get women in the workforce as fast as possible, because that benefits the government. They could care less about your kids. The single greatest factor in the first 3 years of life is a child's emotional well-being. Emotional. Not only is intellectual development secondary, it's practically irrelevant. It is the emotional development of the infant that forms the foundation upon which all later achievements are based. Let me say that again. It's the emotional development of the infant that forms the foundation upon which all later achievements are based. Their intellectual development in the first 3 or 4 years is seriously almost irrelevant. All the political arguments you hear from both Democrats and Republicans regarding early childhood education is crap. These folks have a political agenda, pure and simple. Ignore it. It's not true. I just cannot overemphasize how unbelievably wrong and false that is. It's just a flat out lie. And that leads into my final one, which is this idea that daycare is great for socialization. Again, completely false. A baby in the first 3 or 4 years of life, a child, I guess you should say, in the first 3 years of life, goes through stages. And it's our job to accommodate our lives to meet those developmental needs. Socialization is not a non-factor in the first, say, 4 years of life. 2-year-olds, you'll notice this if you're, those of you who are paying attention, if you really look at it, babies utterly and completely dependent in the first year of life. Totally and completely dependent. Once an infant moves past that first initial stage of complete and utter dependency, say their 2-year-olds are fully into their 2 year their second year, sorry. They don't interact with other children. They don't play with them. They engage in what's called parallel play, which means they're just playing alongside another person that looks like them, essentially. It's not in any way mandatory for their development. It's just what they do. Of course, you can do that in moms groups. You don't need to go to daycare for that. Essentially, a child before the age of 4 can get all he needs from being out and about in the world with his mother. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Now, if you want to put your child, and I certainly did at 3.5, both my kids were in preschool for a few hours a day, several days a week. So like 2.5 hours a day, 3 days a week, let's say. And that's not going to allow me oodles of time, which is the way a lot of parents will use it, which is fine if you do it within reason. But if you're putting them there all day for 3 days a week, it's no longer preschool. It's essentially daycare. So I'm going to come back to that actually, that whole preschool thing in a minute. But the bottom line is, what children need in the first 3 years of life is so huge that when we put them in daycare so casually, as if doing so is harmless or even good, demonstrates how unbelievably clueless we are as a society when it comes to the needs of children. Again, because there's a political agenda to keep this from people, not because people are stupid or even unconcerned. That was the point of my doing this, is that I'm truly seeing a genuine cluelessness. Like, no one has ever told parents this information. They just don't have it. The reality is we're stressing babies out by forcing them into a situation they're not ready for. And this is in part why we have many of the mental health issues we have today. There are other reasons for mental health issues, to be sure, but this is a piece of the puzzle. So, for example, we talk about ADHD, right? Here's some interesting news that a lot of people don't know. ADHD is not actually a disorder. It's a stress reaction. It's a sign, just like the guilt we talked about earlier. It's actually a flight response that causes people who are in humans, let's just say humans, no matter what age they are, but it starts when they're young, to move away to react to a stressful situation by moving very quickly, and they're very easily distracted or agitated, which actually is something I have personally struggled with myself. And certainly daycare is not the only way a child would develop ADHD. There's many other stressful situations in a home that aren't related to that still would result in ADHD. It's whatever the stressful home environment is, which I had one as a child. You develop this reaction to it, right? You're trying to flee it. You're trying to flee, sorry. And so you'll move really quickly or talk really fast or not be able to concentrate. It's very, very common. And to this day, I'm better than I ever have been before, but it really does stay with you for life. And you have to get in control of it if you want to be successful. So the solution to ADHD for the average person, which is not to say that medicine can't be helpful on a temporary basis for some, it certainly can. But the solution isn't to medicate all children who are not behaving properly and slapping them with the ADHD label. So you don't medicate it, you want to diagnose it, figure out why it's happening. So I'm going to go back to the preschool thing now. Preschool was meant as sort of a pre-readiness for kindergarten for a few hours a day, like I said, for 3 or 4-year-olds. That's not how we use it anymore. We've set up a system where children are thrown into these group environments long before they're ready. And then when they respond negatively to it, we slap the ADHD label on it, usually later in life, more when they're 6 or 7, and we call it a disorder. And then we medicate them. And all of this is done in good faith, by the way. I'm not attacking parents. I'm saying I'm trying to educate them about the truth that no one will tell them, because it's easier to label and medicate than it is to self-reflect and make the serious life changes to fix a situation. And of course, educators they're not interested, they don't have the time to do for kids what parents can do. That's why everything at the end of the day really comes down to parenting. It truly does. And I do believe that when parents are educated, at least many of them, about these things that they're not educated about because it's taboo to talk about, they would make different choices. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, even though I'm going to take a lot of flack for it. It's to reach those people who want this information. And all of this, by the way, this whole daycare thing, it's stressing mothers out too. This is why women's attempt to work full-time after having a baby ends usually so disastrously, because their kids are acting out, their marriages are struggling, and yet they're told that this is normal, so they make TikToks about how insane their lives are. And a lot of this is related to daycare, this argument that it doesn't matter whether you're there. That's the message I'm trying to get across, is this bullshit message that it doesn't matter if you're there, that daycare will do just as well. And that is just a bold-faced lie. The good news is it's never too late to switch gears. I truly believe that. That's so important. It's true that kids are resilient in that they will respond to any parent who, changes his or her tune, in any way, at any stage of life. If a parent wanted to start to do better by their kid, the kid's going to, soak that up big time, especially if the parent apologizes for mistakes and learns how to become really child-centric. A child's going to be right there to eat that up. So it's never too late to switch gears. And actually, next week, we're going to talk with a client of mine who did just that. She left a very high-paying job to stay home with her boys, and I think you all will really like that conversation. And I'm so blessed to be able to hear from the women over the years who email me to tell me their stories and how, once they got this information, once they heard from me, they did make the decision to prioritize those early years and be there for their children. And it's just been, it's wonderful. And it really just takes the willingness to tell the truth. That's really all we're talking about here. Just tell the truth and not let anybody tell you shouldn't say it because someone's feelings are going to get hurt. You can't solve problems by just avoiding feelings. You're just going to marinate in that the rest of your life and never get anywhere. You're not going to make any headway if you choose that route. So I really would love to see us as a culture find the courage to not only talk about hard things in general, but to be able to face this very difficult topic head on so that parents, mothers in particular, can make good choices for their kids and for their lives. So on that note, I will see you all next week. And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and to leave us a review, as well as share this episode with a friend. As always, you may reach me with any questions or comments at Suzanne@thesuzannevenkershow.com. And if you would like to support this podcast, which would be very much appreciated, you can do so at patreon.com/The Suzanne Venker Show. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.